Let's go, break it down, put it there, bring it on, step it up, right there, break it down, put it there, here we go, step it up, bring it on, let's go.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the live stream of Studium Generale. Welcome to today's lunch lecture that we are organizing in cooperation with TUE's Institute for Complex Molecular Systems, and to be even more specific, with the focus area Grip on Complexity. Now that's quite a mouthful, but the important thing to remember today, the important term is complexity. Complexity science is a very interesting multidisciplinary approach to look at transitions and emerging systems. Systems that we actually find throughout society, whether it is examining the way we manage a pandemic, the way our democracy functions, or the way we handle a refugee crisis. Today's lecture is the first in a series of lectures in which we want to show you how new insights from complexity can help find answers to today's challenges in society. Now, one of those challenges clearly is our energy system and the transition to a more sustainable alternative. According to our speaker of today, Professor Gert Jan Kramer, rebuilding the energy system should actually be easy. We've got the technology pretty much in place, we've got the money to pay for it, and yet I think we are all realizing that easy it is definitely not. Why there is this discrepancy is what he will be discussing and elaborating on today. Gert-Jan, let me see if you can join me in the stream.
Hello.
Hi, let me properly introduce you to our viewers at home. You are Professor of Sustainable Energy Supply Systems at Utrecht University and also Head of the Energy and Resources Group at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. I would like to point out that for the viewers at home, there is opportunity to ask questions and comments. Put them to Gert Jan Kramer. You can use the chat function on YouTube and Facebook, and we'll try and address some of those questions at the end of the talk. Gert Jan, welcome. The floor is yours. We'd all like to know all about how we can move towards a new energy system.
Thank you very much, Marla, first for the invitation to speak here in an unusual setting, but we'll definitely try and make the very best of it. I should say that I'll speak to you about the energy system and the energy transition, and I think that it has a bearing and that potentially complexity science has something to say about it. But I'm not a specialist on complexity science, so this is for me as much an exploration as it will be for some of you. So let me go back a bit to what Marla said in the introduction. I wrote an abstract and I have a particular thesis that I want to, if you like, prove to you. I said rebuilding the energy system should be easy. And why do we say that? Well, for three reasons. There is a very clear case to rebuild the system from a fossil system to a renewable system. The technology is mostly there, significantly there, and it's affordable. So what are we waiting for? So that in a way suggests that it may not be so easy. If the case is so obvious, if we can do it, why does everything seem to be developing and is developing so painfully slow? And perhaps when you speak to engineers, it comes as a bit of a disappointment when I say it is not just, or not even primarily, an engineering challenge. But we'll see. It would be my thesis here that society hugely matters. What it actually is, well, I hope to explore with you today. Is it resolve? Is it something that in Dutch we call regie, right? So some sort of guidance that comes from the top. But I think at the core of it is that what I do strongly believe, and I think you all sense, is that energy is basically fully interwoven with virtually every aspect of society. And that is change the one. You basically are changing society. So I believe, and that will be the end of my talk, and more an open question, that it is useful to see the energy system as a complex system, a complex adaptive system, but I'm not quite sure, speaking to you now, what actually the insights is and whether that helps us. And so for those of you who can make it, and there is a possibility, whereas there is follow-up of this, a debate within the Complexity Center next Friday on this topic. So that by way of introduction to this relatively short lecture, I'll actually take it for granted that most of you, if not all of you, know a good deal already about energy, about renewable energy, and about the transition. So I'll skip over lots of things, but hopefully what I do tell you will be new in aspects and interesting. So first, I said the case for change is very clear, and actually in the spirit of what I said that I would put it in the context of complexity, I think what you see here are two graphs from a very nice paper by Stefan of just 2 years ago, which for me is a beautiful, well, a frightening also illustration of what it means to be in the Anthropocene, right? Prior to this century, the Earth, our planet, was moving in this glacial, interglacial cycle. But the point is, through our burning of fossil fuels and the release of greenhouse gases over the past decades, we've actually moved all of our planet onto a different trajectory, which we should work very hard to contain that and to see that it doesn't go off into a very uncomfortable hot house Earth type of environment. So the case is very clear. If we do not act in these decades, this decade, in this century, then we're in for, well, something that looks disastrous, if not to life itself, then certainly to our species and most definitely to our affluence and all of that we call our civilization. So that's one thing. The second statement, the technology exists. Well, I said I'd be light on this, but you see here a rusty old turbine and beyond the mist, two towering turbines, indicative, and wind and solar. These are the workhorses of the energy transition. And it's useful to remind an audience that their scalability, the ability to do wind and solar at truly massive scale, is something that we only possess since the year 2000, and fully at scale only since the 2010s, so only 10 years, right? So, but now we have it. And then we know also now since more than a decade, well, it's actually, I thought it was a different slide, but we know now that you can make wonderful slides, right? It's not just solar and wind, there's definitely more, right? And you see here, say, sort of optimistic, challenging, imaginative thing, which was pieced together by scientists in the Netherlands. Forgot what exactly the source was. My apologies for that. But there's more than solar and wind. Yes, there's plenty of it, but there is also batteries, there is hydrogen, etc., etc. And let me put a disclaimer in when I say engineering, it's all done, and scientifically, no. There is a lot more that is yet to be invented and yet to be developed. But the pace of change, purely when you look at technology, could be a lot bigger. To put perhaps a figure on it, the investments in renewable, solar and wind, have been around 300 billion globally annually, and they haven't grown very much. From a technical perspective, in my view, they could at least be 1 trillion. So something is holding us back. And it isn't a cost per se, because in fact we know, at least as long as solar and wind have been around, thanks to the Stern review by Nicholas Stern, seen here at the launch of the report in 2006. This is the finance minister at the time, Gordon Brown. We know, and Stern first calculated, postulated, argued that the energy transition would not sacrifice more than 1% of GDP. So in all aspects, it should truly be a no-brainer, right? The downside risk is so much more gravitas than this 1%. So why aren't we doing this? Now, how does it look? And is the thing believable, right? Here's how I would see it, and I think this is useful for you to know, right? If the economy is 100%, energy is roughly 10% of that economy. I mean, it's not an exact figure, but roughly, to keep our economy going, everything that is related to energy, from the transmission networks of power to the power stations to oil and gas exploration and production, etc., and all of that up, it's roughly 10% of the economy. And so when we say that the energy transition costs 1%, it's actually 10% of that energy. So if you will, the transition make energy 10% more expensive. I realize, and I think ever since 2006, I think people have had a hard time to really believe that that is true. So let me put you, perhaps feed you with one bit of information, which suggests that a renewable future might not be all that more expensive than a fossil fuel economy. And it's a bit of a rhetorical argument, but, well, rhetoric sometimes work. My background for quite some time, until 5 years ago, was at Shell. I worked for a long time on renewables in Shell. And when I was there, I once did this simple calculus. Shell invested at the time 30 billion annually to keep oil and gas production at 3 million barrels per day. Well, that's an energy number, and this is an investment number. If you divide the one by the other, that means that for every dollar that Shell's invest, it manages to deliver 200 megajoule of energy to end customers. Now, how does that look on the renewable side? A megawatt wind turbine costs about $1 million. Over its 20 years life, it produces 200 terajoule. Divide the one by the other, you get roughly the same 200 megajoules per dollar of investment. Well, if anything, this makes you understand that oil companies, Shell, but equally others, have recently, because this is a plain fact for them, have redefined themselves and are moving to be energy companies. Because, in all fairness, that is, you would say, where the money and where the technology logically drives them. So that is very powerful. And 20 years ago, this was not the case. So we're in a unique situation now, which is good to remember. So all of this was in fact very good, very positive news, right? So let's now explore if it is so easy, right? If there's so many positive things, why is it then not easy, right? What's keeping us back? First, I found this actually in preparation for this lecture. It comes from Germany, but I expect it is not much different in the Netherlands. 90% of Germans, according to a survey of last year, are supportive of the energy transition, right? Very few people are in denial about climate change, and even fewer people would say that it isn't a worthy goal to move away from fossil fuels and put instead in place a renewable energy system. But 75% think that the way this pans out, and it's largely seen as through government policy, rightly or wrongly, is expensive. The whole transition feels chaotic. Half thinks it's unfair, and just about half thinks it's elitist as well. That is a concern, and I think it is a concern for me, and I think for many of you as well, as scientists, as academics, as, if you will, part of the elite, right? If anything, it tells us that there is a great deal of education to be done and taking people along in the journey. But just talking won't be everything. I absolutely admit that. Doing things is also important. And if this is an abstract survey, then I think that it isn't easy. The Dutch journey, I find absolutely fascinating, right? When I talk to students or to you, I always say, you know, if it wasn't for the Paris Climate Agreement, the present government that we have would not, in my view, have come forward, stepped up with such a radically aggressive plan to deal with climate change and rebuild the energy system. Over years, 2 years of good Dutch poldering, we came to a climate agreement, Klimaatakkoord, which has really been discussed and is supported by many, many stakeholders in society. And it covers, we'll see that in the next slide, it basically covers all of the energy system. I find this a fantastic achievement. And it is also an achievement, well, now I see two in one, wait a minute. So in political terms, right, so you see here our good Prime Minister Rutte painted in a cartoon of, for those who are older, in a very left-wing socialist election poster of the 1960s. But there is something radical, you might call it, it's almost green right, what has happened, an embrace by a traditional party which has not been enamored very much until recently with the climate or the energy transition. The same prime minister used to say not so long ago that windmolens draaien op subsidie, wind turbines turn because of subsidy, but he's made the turnaround. Which is fantastic, right? So in American terms or in Anglo-Saxon terms, there is a bipartisan support for this. But it doesn't make it easy. And I could have picked a news clip basically of any week since, but this is this week's news clips, right? How this play out. Now we got to put the investments in place, right? And this is from the Financieel Dagblad, Shell and Exxon. So the archetype, put them together, the sort of the archetypical villains of the old economy. They are eyeing billions of green subsidies. This is around a scheme for carbon capture and storage, which would be very important in reaching the targets, but immediately generates societal debates, and it feeds all those anxieties that we saw in the opinion poll for Germany. So it isn't easy to pull this off, well, in society. Let's now, because this is after all a lecture to people at a technical university, let's show some numbers. Let's look at some charts. Where are we, right? These are the Dutch emissions since the base year 1990, and we haven't done a whole lot in the 25 years since then. The counter stood at minus 12% in 2015, and we're eyeing something like 95% reduction by the middle of the century. Well, current policies would get us to minus 30%, which is a mild acceleration at best from where we were heading. So on a slow downward slope, right? Things are absolutely easier, but we have collectively concluded this is by no means good enough. And this climate agreement, exactly this, which is on the one hand fantastic, on the other hand also a bit sobering, because if you know there's so much that you read about in the newspapers and what does it affect, right? It's a mere 90%, 1/5 of all of it. And even to get to this 20%, right, is many megatons of annual emissions. And it's quite something to actually find those megatons. And here's what happens. And in good Dutch poldering fashion, there were 5 tables created for each sector. And the tables was where the poldering happens, right? And what did those polders come up with? Well, with these sort of pie charts of future reduction, right? Size of the pie is how much. The bigger outer pie is if you reach the plan in order to reach that -49, and the hard core of the charts is what our rekenmeesters, the Environmental Bureau, says is basically, well, hard certain that we can achieve. The rest will be damn hard work to make that that happen. And you see, there's quite a bit of uncertainty around it. Even if we put measures in place, nothing is guaranteed, not even for this additional 90%. Not surprisingly, perhaps, because of what I told you, right? The most certain thing of all of this is electricity, right? That is, 99% of that is more solar and more wind, especially more offshore wind, right? So that's good, right? We'll take one look here, and then we'll look at industry to make the point that, again, none of this is particularly easy. So on the electricity, right? This is easy, right? PV panels, solar panels as far as you can see, and as far as wind turbines as far as you can see on the great blue yonder of the North Sea. Less easy is both storage and transport, right? These are real issues, and they are not so much technical issues as, well, this to a degree is a technical issue, but this, copper wires, is very much a planning issue. My hope is that we do manage to keep the pace up here on the not so easy part, in order that the rolling out, the ever greater deployment of solar and wind does not stall at some point in the next decade. Okay, but this, for all things, is easy, right? Electricity. Less easy, but very important is industry. For one thing, because if you compare the Netherlands to its neighbors, we have an awful lot of energy, right? Where you can build environment, and this is per capita energy use or transport or services, we're just the same as our neighbors in our neighboring countries, but we're different because of the port of Rotterdam and our industrial clusters on the coast. We have an enormous industry, and we have an enormous chemical industry. So we have one hell of a job to do, and it's great that our plans are so ambitious. But a significant chunk, half of that, is to come from carbon capture and storage, now under the guise of carbon capture utilization of storage, where utilization is a bit of a iffy, unclear proposition. And I think it's enough to say it is unclear how this will pan out, if it will have the societal acceptance that it needs to get to the many, many megatons that are in the plans. That is not a technical question, but it's socially, societally, very much an open question, where work, education, discussion, in my view, still has to happen before we see that part of the plans being fulfilled. There's also electrification, which has a very significant infrastructure component to it. It's not so clear that the two of them actually point in the same direction, and that is even more so if you say that lots of what we have in the Netherlands is chemical industry, and then we also have this grand ambition of building a circular industry, right? A circular society, so the circular economy. All of this are lofty goals, and good, important directions. But it is at this moment, to this speaker and to virtually everybody I'll speak to, unclear how all of these, whether or not all of these targets and all of these solutions steer us in the same direction, or that we're actually pulled in very different directions, which of course would make progress difficult. I don't think that this is finally, but a difficulty which we will have to come to grips with in the coming decades is spatial planning. This is how much energy we use, 3 exajoules, 3,000 petajoules, and this is how it is made up, right? Largely oil, gas and coal, and a sliver of renewables. But this is the land, and the hard truth of renewable energy is that it's very diluted. So if your view and our view is that in the end we have no choice but to be fully renewable, and this looks like, well, half a plausible way to get there and make up the 3 exajoule that we use annually, then on the back of the envelope you can calculate that this is just about what it needs spatially, right? Half our offshore thing will be filled with wind turbines. 2 or 3 provinces are covered with wind turbines. 1 province, Utrecht, is covered with solar panels, and we need another Netherlands to make up this share of biofuels. This is awfully challenging, right? We're just at the beginning. And many of us are already complaining that we're constrained and don't want it in our backyards. This is what already led David Mackay in the UK in his famous book, or related to his famous book, Sustainable Energy Without a Hot Air, had to say industrialization of the countryside. There's almost it's an awful term. And when David Mackay, as an anecdote, became the chief scientist for energy in the UK, he was politely asked by those in government, don't you please ever use that term again. And that's precisely because this is in a way frightening, right? I think we're just beginning to come to grips with it. And I was recently at an event where the presenter said, you know, when it comes to acceptance and lifestyle change, actually, part of our lifestyle change is on the consumer side, right? Consuming less energy, but part of lifestyle change is also just looking out of the window, seeing a wind turbine and saying, yes, that's what we need, right? But it's very clear, I think, to all of us that we're not there yet. I realize that I'm probably at the end of what I can say and the time that is allotted to me. So I'm looking at Marla. I sort of come to the end of it. So feel free to say your time is up and I will finish very rapidly. But I think 1 or 2 slides and then we're there.
Take a few more moments, sure.
Sure, thanks. So this is coming back to the beginning. The idea, well, it just costs 1%, right? So what are we waiting for? We've seen a couple of the challenges, but now mind you, financially, 1%, right? It permeates throughout the whole economy, right? So also on the social side, when it comes to fairness, there is a very difficult task ahead of us. And perhaps in view of time, I won't say too much about this slide, but this is work that INO Research did, and I've been in touch with them and actually did work which sort of built on this work, which sort of confirmed what you see here, whether people are in their income below, at average or above average, hardly affects how much energy they use and how much CO2 emissions they produce. So this challenges that just giving it a price, right, is the fair way to do it. So who pays? Well, you know, you could say there are 3 classes of stakeholders and three ways that people can pay for it, right? They can either pay as consumers, they can pay as citizens through their taxes, or perhaps, as some would say, it's the shareholders that should pay. Well, whichever way you look at it, right, there is no denying that there is a bill to be paid. And even though in aggregate it's 1%, the bill is hefty, and even for projects, right, runs in the billions, right? And finding a billion is never easy. So in spite of the 1% that it net costs, there is still quite a challenge ahead of us. And basically, I'm stating the obvious, right? In doing this in an equitable manner, in a fair manner, and coming back to the Germans' opinion poll that we had, half of the people in Germany, and I expect it's not much different in the Netherlands, feel that it doesn't feel quite fair to them. So work ahead, and I think in the light of what I was going to say, very important work and work that is critical to get on the right timeline and be able to get basically our transition significantly done by the middle of the century. Well, last slide. What is this tell about complexity, right? I looked up in a paper on complex adaptive systems, which are one type of way to look at complexity, right? A complex system is a network of many agents that gather information, learn, act in parallel in an environment that produces interactions. Well, check. That is what we have. The system co-evolves with the environment. Environment here in a very broad sense, and I think I put that to you. So check. And here's an order is emergent, right? Not predetermined. There's very many ways in which technology advances and societal choices will interplay, and they determine the outcome, right? Important to know, there is not one unique way in which we have to rebuild the energy system. There are choices to be made. So check. The second one is, and these are more observations, and complex adaptive systems are balanced between order and anarchy at the edge of chaos. Well, that's not particularly comforting, right, to us watching this, but I take it, well, that's the way it is, right? So perhaps nothing to worry about. And by their nature, they have a future that is hard to predict. So I tend to, well, I worked a lot in Shell in scenarios, and we say, well, we do scenarios because the future is hard to predict. But mind you, the energy transition creates enormous uncertainties, and it's hard, especially for investors, to put an investment in place when the future looks so uncertain. That's another difficulty of the energy transition. Finally, last words. There are insights from one of the founding fathers of this field, Stuart Kaufman, that a complex adaptive system functions through hierarchical organization with vertical feedback. So I think that's a nice way to bring it back to the Netherlands. On the one hand, we have a fantastic this thing of polderen, right, bringing everybody together. What we often say is missing is regie, right, some government coordination. So for the moment, and for the purpose of this lecture, I find some guidance from Kaufman's insight that, yes, if this is the energy transition, it is a complex thing. It can't do, arguably, without more guidance from above than we presently have. And with that, let me thank you for attention and apologize for running, I think, a bit over time.
No problem, Gert Jan. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And I can tell you that we've got a lot of questions coming in the chat. And I think one that I have to mention, because it comes back it's asked by several people, is about nuclear energy and nuclear fusion. And of course, you mentioned, I think halfway through your talk, the easy part is that we've got the solar energy and the wind energy. Yeah, what is your view
Well,
on
what about
what about nuclear
yeah.
fusion? Is that also a proper
Yeah,
option?
well, I've been in touch for decades by now with Nick Lopez Cardozo and at your university. Nick and I have discussed the prospects of fusion precisely in the light of the energy transition a lot and in depth. And I think our conclusion is, yes, it's got merit, perhaps, but it's awfully difficult to pull off, and it will come too late. Right? It used to be for many years only 50 years away. I think now it's even 80 years away. So as a human endeavor, right, as something that we do in society to prepare ourselves for the long-term future, perhaps there are merits in that, but it will not help us in 2050, perhaps sort of by 2100, but there's nothing in the here and now that is affected by it once coming to life or not. Fission, I think, is somewhat of a different story. It has a role, but I would stick to the consensus which has been in many, many reports that if we see something that approaches a nuclear renaissance, right, then just nuclear energy keeping to its 10 or 15% share of the electricity mix would already be quite something, because right now it's going down rather than up. And also, I think it's very, it's playing out regionally, right? It is important in Asia, in China, absolutely. Is it important in the Netherlands? I always said, no, it isn't. And the reason for that is I'd say it's the path not chosen. I don't think it has a role in the energy system. I used to say that quite firmly, and I would now say that the only thing that might bring it back into the debate, and I'm sort of hesitant, you sense, to say that, is that spatial.
I was going to say, let me bring in an argument that someone put forward in the chat, which is in terms of the aesthetic problem that we have, for example, with all the windmills and all the solar panels in the Netherlands.
Yes, that might be an argument. We'll learn and we'll see how it plays out. Here we are in the space of true unpredictability, right? I don't think that it will fundamentally solve it. I find it very hard to see that even if we say, yes, let's do nuclear, let's bring that into the mix, that would change in any way what we need to do, right? At best, you'd come out at a 50-50 thing, and then basically on the wind and solar side, it would still look the same.
Okay, let me bring in one more alternative, perhaps. I don't know if you know this. It's the iron fuel system that's being developed here at TU Eindhoven by actually by a student team, Team Solid. And they are curious to hear your view on that, on whether iron fuel could be a proper alternative as well.
I'm very skeptical, to be honest, about that. And I like to think I know a bit about alternative fuels. When I came into the field of renewables and alternatives, it was through hydrogen as a fuel. Now, I know that isn't easy, but it looks a lot easier and a lot more attractive than iron, I would say. So I would in generally say that moves away from hydrocarbons are very problematic from a transition perspective. I think there is a very good reason and there is very good technology to go through hydrogen. I think that any other alternative that I've seen, and that includes, apart from iron fuel, also ammonia, hasn't got the beauty of what hydrogen offers, but will suffer from at least the same amount of transition problems, albeit somewhat different in character, but fundamentally it's still an enormous transition challenge.
Okay, maybe a final question. A question about the lobbying power of companies and also political parties, and what would be the best way to overcome that?
Sorry, overcome what? I missed that.
I think the lobbying power of some political parties and companies actually against the energy transition, or a kind of blocking certain developments. Maybe the first question is, do you agree that this is happening?
I think there is in a way inevitably a lobbying, right? I'm presently involved with work. I set up an institute which is will be a think tank for the transition in industry, and I've sat around the table with industry parties, NGOs, governments. Everybody realizes that in the hustle bustle in the here and now, inevitably everybody speaks for themselves and is engaged in some lobbying, right? I would say we're lucky in that, on the whole, we're not resistant to change, right? But
someone now brings in Donald Trump as an example, as someone who might be blocking certain developments.
Oh yes, absolutely, right. And so globally, it's not helpful that the US has had a president like Trump in the past years. It would have been very different had it been Hillary Clinton. But the reality, there's always something, right? And let's focus for the moment on the Netherlands. I think in the Netherlands, there is not hardcore resistance, right? I mean, I think very generally, there is an embrace that we should work in concert to bring about systemic change towards the middle of the century. But we're not necessarily in agreement what precisely it is, at what time certain changes need to be done. So what the consecutive order is of that, and also who should pay and what fairness is. So I think here I see an important role for us academics, not so much what I see a lot as university professors and others championing certain ideas. But I think we have to, as academics, use more of the let's step back and try and see the whole of it, and then educate and guide the population at large and the politicians that we choose to make informed decisions.
Right. I think that's a very nice message to end with. Unfortunately, I see there are still more questions coming in, but we're out of time for today. Gert Jan, thank you very much for sharing with us your insights about, well, the complexity of moving towards a new energy system and all the different factors that we have to take into account, certainly also as engineers. Thank you very much. Let me point out that, as Gert Jan already mentioned, on the 27th of November, the ICMS will be organizing an in-depth lecture called Complex Friday about the same topic. That will be hosted by Professor David Smulders. You can now find the link in the chat with more information on how to register. It is accessible for everyone within TUE. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is the first lecture of part of a series about complexity science that we will continue in the next quartile. For the Bachelor College students, you can now register for use using the link in the chat as well. Thank you all for watching. We hope you have enjoyed today's program, and we look forward to seeing you back next week with both a lecture about and a theater visit to one of the most famous ballets of all time, the Swan Lake. So we hope to see you back next week, and thanks.